My name is Alexandra Sterling. I am 36 years old. I am the Chief Technology Officer for the Department of Defense's Advanced Research Division. But to my family, none of that has ever mattered. To them, I was the antisocial computer geek, the daughter who chose machines over marriage and brought shame to the Sterling name. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I was the one they whispered about at every family gathering, the one they pitied behind closed doors, the disappointment who never learned how to be a proper woman. And on my father's 68th birthday, surrounded by aunts, uncles, cousins, and longtime family friends, in the sprawling backyard of our old brick colonial in suburban Charlotte, they made sure everyone knew exactly what they thought of me. I still remember the oppressive North Carolina humidity clinging to my skin that afternoon as I stood alone by the garden gate, watching through the kitchen window as my family laughed, raised glasses in toast, and shared stories that never included me. I wasn't part of the celebration. I wasn't wanted at the main table. I stood there in my navy blazer and pressed slacks, the only woman not wearing a sundress, the only one not discussing recipes or grandchildren, all because I had failed them. At least, that's what they told anyone who would listen. They had no idea who I really was, no idea what I had built, no idea what was coming in exactly 43 minutes. The words sliced through the warm afternoon air like shards of glass. My older sister Victoria's voice carried across the patio as she gestured toward me with her glass of rosé. Look at her over there. Still don't know how to talk to people. 36 years old, and she's never even had a serious boyfriend. My sister-in-law Amanda laughed, that cruel sound she made when she thought she was being clever. What does she even do all day? Play on her computer. I heard she got laid off from that IT place months ago. They didn't bother lowering their voices. My father, the man we were supposedly celebrating, chuckled and shook his head. Alexandra has always been different. Some women just aren't cut out for traditional success. Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, raised his beer bottle in a mock toast. Here's to the family genius who can't even keep a job at a computer store. The laughter that followed felt like poison in my veins, but I held my ground. I stood perfectly still by that gate, hands clasped behind my back, watching the ice melt in abandoned mint juleps on the picnic table. I didn't flinch because I knew something they didn't. Something that would change everything in less than an hour. My cousin Jennifer, always eager to join in when the family had a target, smirked as she approached the group. I mean, who shows up to a birthday party dressed like she's going to a business meeting? It's pathetic. She took a sip of her cocktail. Mom told me she's been unemployed for months. Couldn't even handle working at Best Buy. The lies stacked on top of each other like fallen dominoes, each one burying the truth a little deeper. They created their own version of my life, one that made them feel better about their own choices, their own narrow definitions of success. In their story, I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happens when a woman doesn't follow the prescribed path of marriage, children, and suburban domesticity. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pitcher of sweet tea, her face flushed from the heat of cooking all morning. She set the pitcher down with deliberate care, and glanced in my direction with that look I knew so well. Disappointment mixed with maternal concern. "Alexandra, sweetheart," she called out, her voice artificially bright for the benefit of the guests. "Why don't you come join us? Your Aunt Susan was just asking about your situation." Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister, pursed her lips in that way that meant judgment was imminent. "Catherine, I just don't understand why she won't settle down and find something stable. My neighbor's daughter just got married to a lovely accountant, makes good money, has benefits. Maybe Alexandra could meet some nice men if she tried." The suggestion hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Meet some nice men, get married, have children, live a small, comprehensible life that they could understand and approve of. I watched my father flip steaks on his new gas grill, the one Victoria had bought him for his birthday. 68 years old, my father announced to the assembled guests, and I'm still trying to figure out where I went wrong with that girl. The conversation continued around me, voices blending into a familiar chorus of disappointment. They discussed my employment status, my lack of a husband, my antisocial tendencies, my failure to give them grandchildren, my refusal to attend family gatherings more than absolutely necessary. They dissected my life like amateur psychologists examining a case study, poking and prodding at what they perceived as my failure. My youngest cousin Sarah, barely 24, and newly engaged with a marketing degree, joined the conversation with the confidence of someone who had never truly struggled. I just think Aunt Alexandra needs to put herself out there more. Maybe try dating apps, learn some social skills. As if the ability to make small talk about wedding planning and baby names was the measure of a woman's worth. As if the thousands of hours I had spent learning, creating, building systems that protected this country meant nothing because I couldn't giggle at my sister's husband's inappropriate jokes, or pretend to care about the latest fashion trend. The sun beat down mercilessly, and perspiration began to form at the nape of my neck. I loosened my collar slightly, and checked my watch. 29 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on me. In 29 minutes, everything they thought they knew about me would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. But for now, I was still the family failure, the strange daughter who had somehow disappointed everyone simply by being herself, the woman who chose a different path and was punished for it at every family gathering, every holiday, every phone call that ended too quickly. I could hear my mother explaining to the neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had stopped by to wish my father a happy birthday. "We just worry about her, you know. She's so smart, but she just can't seem to find her place in the world. We keep hoping she'll meet a good man, settle down, maybe give us some grandchildren before it's too late. Before it's too late." As if my value as a woman expired with my fertility. As if my worth could only be measured by my ability to produce the next generation of Sterlings. The sound of children playing in the yard mixed with adult conversation and the sizzle of meat on the grill. It was the perfect picture of Southern family happiness, complete with mason jar lights, strung between the oak trees and citronella torches to keep the mosquitoes at bay. And there I stood at the edge of it all, the outsider looking in, the daughter who had never quite fit into the mold they had cast for her. 26 minutes now. I adjusted my position slightly, my posture still straight, my expression neutral. They had no idea what was coming. No idea that in less than half an hour their carefully constructed narrative about their failure of a daughter would explode in the most spectacular way possible. But I knew, and that knowledge sat in my chest like a quiet flame, waiting to ignite everything they thought they understood about success, about worth, about what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the phone in my pocket was about to ring with a call that would change everything. Growing up in the Sterling household meant learning early that there was a right way to be a daughter, and I was doing it wrong. From my earliest memories, I was the puzzle piece that didn't fit, the picture my parents had painted of their perfect Southern family. I can still see myself at 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of our living room while my older sister Victoria practiced piano in the next room. The sounds of her scales and arpeggios drifted through the doorway as I carefully disassembled an old calculator I'd found in my father's desk, studying how the tiny circuits connected to form a machine that could think. My mother would find me there hours later, surrounded by microchips and circuit boards, my small fingers tracing the pathways of copper that carried invisible signals from one component to another. "Alexandra, sweetheart," she'd say with that gentle exasperation that became her default tone with me, "why don't you go help Victoria with her recital preparation?" But Victoria's world held no fascination for me. The rules of proper comportment seemed arbitrary and pointless compared to the elegant logic of electronic systems. While Victoria learned to play Chopin perfectly, I learned to understand the language machines spoke to each other. While she collected porcelain dolls, I collected discarded electronics from neighbors' trash bins, bringing them home like treasure. The dinner table was where the differences became most apparent. Victoria would regale our parents with stories from cotillion classes, her latest achievements in ballet, the compliments she'd received on her manners and appearance. She was everything a Sterling daughter should be: graceful, accomplished, socially adept, easy to understand and showcase. I would sit quietly, mechanically eating my cornbread while they discussed Victoria's latest triumph. When the conversation inevitably turned to me, it was always with a note of concern. "How was school today, Alexandra?" my mother would ask, and I would answer honestly, "Fine." Because what could I tell them? That I had spent recess in the computer lab, mesmerized by programming languages that made more sense to me than the social hierarchies of fourth grade, that I had solved a math problem that stumped even my teacher, that I had written my first piece of code that actually worked. They wouldn't understand. They never did. By the time I was 13, the pattern was firmly established. Victoria was the golden child, the one who brought home blue ribbons from horse shows and perfect scores in subjects that mattered to Southern society: literature, history, French. I brought home straight A's in mathematics and science, but those achievements seemed to worry them more than celebrate them. "She's too smart for her own good," I heard my father tell my uncle one evening when they thought I wasn't listening. "A girl needs to learn how to charm people, not just impress them with her brain." The irony was that I understood people perfectly well. I understood that my father measured a daughter's success by how well she could attract a suitable husband. I understood that my mother equated social graces with moral worth. I understood that Victoria's effortless femininity and conventional interests made her the daughter they had always dreamed of, while my fascination with technology made me the daughter they didn't know how to display proud. High school was where the divide became a chasm. While Victoria reigned as homecoming queen and dated the captain of the football team, I spent my afternoons in the computer lab, teaching myself programming languages that weren't even offered in our curriculum. I built my first functioning computer from spare parts when I was 16, creating something from nothing, using skills I had taught myself through trial and error and countless hours of patient experimentation. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. When I showed it to my parents, proudly demonstrating how I had written the operating system from scratch, my father nodded politely and asked when I planned to try out for the debate team. My mother suggested I might want to focus more on developing my social skills and less on those computer things. The night Victoria was crowned prom queen, our house filled with relatives and neighbors celebrating her achievement. I watched from the kitchen doorway as she posed for photos in her tiara and pink gown, surrounded by people who understood exactly what her success meant. 4 years of college at a prestigious women's school, a degree in something appropriately feminine, marriage to a young man from a good family, children who would carry on the sterling legacy with pride. That same week, I had been accepted into Carnegie Mellon's computer science program, with a full scholarship based on a cybersecurity application I had developed for network protection. When I told my parents, they seemed more concerned about the school's location than proud of the achievement. "Pittsburgh is so far away," my mother said, worrying about the pearls at her throat. "And computer science. Sweetheart, that's not really a field for ladies. What about teaching? You'd make a wonderful teacher." My father was more direct. "Alexandra, you need to think about your future. Victoria's studying art history. That's something that will serve her well as a wife and mother. This computer business, it's just a phase." A phase. 15,000 lines of code, 4 programming languages, a security protocol that could protect entire networks from cyber attacks. And to them, it was just a phase. Like collecting stickers or playing with makeup. I left for Pennsylvania that fall with 2 suitcases and a scholarship letter. My parents had read once and filed away without comment. Victoria's college send-off had involved a garden party with half the neighborhood. Mine involved a quiet ride to the airport and a hug from my mother that felt more like a goodbye to who she wished I could be. At Carnegie Mellon, I found something I had never experienced before: belonging. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, who understood that solving complex problems wasn't unfeminine behavior but intellectual courage. My professors didn't worry about my social graces. They marveled at my ability to see patterns others missed, to write code that was both elegant and powerful. During my sophomore year, I developed an encryption algorithm that caught the attention of a visiting professor from the Defense Department. Dr. Margaret Chen was unlike any woman I had ever met. She spoke in practical terms about real-world applications, about protecting infrastructure and saving lives through technology. "What you've created here," she said, reviewing my work with the intensity of someone who understood its implications, "could revolutionize how we protect sensitive communications. Have you ever considered a career in national security?" The conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, I knew I had found my calling, not just programming for the sake of solving puzzles, but using technology to protect something larger than myself. Dr. Chen became my mentor, guiding me toward graduate programs and internships that most students didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, my family's phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Victoria's updates dominated every conversation: her successful college career, her engagement to a law student from a prominent Charleston family, their plans for a traditional Southern wedding, and a house in the historic district. When they asked about my studies, I learned to keep my answers brief and vague. "I'm working on some cybersecurity projects" was easier than explaining that I was developing defensive protocols for critical infrastructure. "Things are going well" was simpler than describing the classified research that was beginning to define my career path. The summer between my junior and senior years, I came home for 3 weeks. Victoria had graduated and was planning her wedding, already talking about starting a family and continuing the sterling tradition of raising proper Southern ladies. She regaled dinner guests with stories about her trousseau and her fiancé's promising career, painting a picture of a life they could easily understand and admire. When someone asked about my plans after graduation, I mentioned that I was considering graduate school and some government opportunities. The conversation moved on quickly, as if my future was less interesting than Victoria's, because it was less familiar, less appropriately feminine. That was the last time I tried to explain my world to them. I realized that night, sitting in my childhood bedroom surrounded by obsolete electronics and computer science textbooks they had never asked about, that some distances can't be measured in miles, some differences can't be bridged with good intentions. I wasn't their failure. I was their foreign language, and they had never learned to speak it. The path I chose from that moment forward would take me further from their understanding with each step, but it would also take me towards something they couldn't imagine: a career protecting the very freedoms they took for granted, using skills they dismissed as unfeminine hobbies to safeguard the infrastructure of the country they loved. They wanted a daughter who fit their definition of success. Instead, they got a daughter who would redefine what success could look like for a woman. 22 minutes now. The phone in my pocket felt heavier with each passing moment. Graduate school at MIT changed everything. Dr. Chen had recommended their advanced cybersecurity program, and within weeks of arriving in Massachusetts, I found myself working on projects that existed in the shadowy intersection between academic research and national defense. My thesis advisor, Professor Williams, was a former CIA analyst who spoke in code names and classified clearance levels. The first day she handed me a non-disclosure agreement thicker than most textbooks, I knew I was entering a world my family would never understand, even if I were allowed to explain it. "What we do here," Professor Williams said, her voice barely above a whisper in her cluttered office, lined with signal-blocking equipment, "doesn't exist on any university catalog. You'll be working on defensive protocols for infrastructure that keeps this country running: power grids, financial systems, communications networks. If someone wanted to bring America to its knees without firing a single shot, these are the systems they'd target." The work was intoxicating. 20-hour days became normal as I dove into projects that challenged every assumption I had about security and vulnerability. I was designing digital fortresses to protect against enemies who existed only as ghost signatures in network traffic, phantom attacks that could cripple entire cities if successful. My first major breakthrough came during my second year. I had been analyzing a simulated attack on the California power grid when I noticed an anomaly in the data patterns. Most cyber attacks followed predictable pathways, like water finding the easiest route downhill. But this one was different. It probed defensive systems with an almost organic intelligence, adapting and evolving in real time. For 4 weeks, I lived in the lab, surviving on vending machine coffee and energy bars. I filled whiteboards with algorithm fragments and network diagrams, chasing a solution that seemed to dance just beyond my reach. My fellow graduate students thought I had lost my mind, talking to myself as I worked through logic problems that existed only in my head. The breakthrough came at 2:23 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in November. I was staring at lines of code that had become as familiar as my own handwriting when suddenly the pattern emerged, not just a solution, but an elegant defensive architecture that could adapt to threats as they evolved, learning from each attack attempt and becoming stronger. I called Dr. Chen immediately, despite the hour. "I think I've got something," I said, my voice hoarse from exhaustion and excitement. She was in my lab, 7 hours later, along with 2 women in dark suits who never introduced themselves beyond their first names. They studied my work in silence, occasionally exchanging glances that seemed to carry entire conversations. "How quickly can you implement this?" one of them asked finally. "The prototype is already functional," I replied. "Full deployment would depend on the scale of the network you want to protect." They left without another word, but the next morning I found an envelope on my desk containing a security clearance application and a phone number to call when I had completed it. That was how I learned that my thesis research was actually contracted work for the Department of Defense. My professors weren't just academics. They were consultants for agencies whose names I wasn't cleared to know. The university laboratory where I spent my days was actually a front for one of the most sophisticated cybersecurity research operations in the country. The clearance process took 9 months. Background investigators interviewed neighbors I barely knew, professors from classes I had taken years earlier, even the barista at the coffee shop where I bought my morning espresso. They wanted to know everything: my political beliefs, my financial history, my personal relationships, my family dynamics. The family interview was particularly painful. I sat in a sterile government office while an investigator asked my parents about my character, my loyalty, and my potential vulnerabilities. Through the speakerphone, I could hear the confusion in their voices as they tried to answer questions about a daughter they had never really understood. "Alexandra has always been very focused," my mother said carefully. "Maybe too focused. She doesn't really have close friends, and has never had a serious boyfriend. She's always been more interested in computers than people." My father was more direct. "Look, Agent, whatever your name is, my daughter is a good girl, but she's not exactly leadership material. She's smart, sure, but she's never been much of a team player. Always been kind of a loner. Not very feminine, if you know what I mean." The investigators' questions grew more specific. Had they ever observed any behavior that might indicate disloyalty to the United States? Any associations with foreign nationals? Any personal relationships that might make me susceptible to compromise? "No, nothing like that," my father replied. "Alexandra barely has a social life, let alone any suspicious connections. Honestly, we're not even sure what kind of job she's applying for. She's been pretty secretive about the whole thing. We worry she's gotten involved with something she can't handle." Secretive? Something she can't handle. The words stung because they were both true and completely misunderstood. I wasn't secretive by choice. I was secretive by necessity. The work I was doing, the clearances I was pursuing, the career I was building, all of it existed in a classified world that I couldn't share even if I wanted to. When my clearance finally came through, I was assigned to a joint task force operating out of a secure facility in Northern Virginia. My official title was Senior Cybersecurity Research Analyst, but the reality was far more complex. I was part of a team tasked with defending critical infrastructure against state-sponsored cyber attacks. The work was unlike anything I had imagined. We weren't just writing defensive software, we were engaged in a digital Cold War, fighting battles that the public would never know about against adversaries who remained faceless and nameless. When a power grid in Texas suffered mysterious fluctuations, we were the ones who traced the attack back to servers in Eastern Europe. When financial institutions reported unusual network activity, We were the ones who built the digital barriers that stopped theft attempts measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. My days began at 4:30 a.m. with threat briefings that read like science fiction novels. Foreign intelligence services probing nuclear facility control systems. Criminal organizations testing vulnerabilities in banking networks. Terrorist groups exploring weaknesses in transportation infrastructure. Each morning brought new crises that required immediate response from people who couldn't tell their families what they did for work. The isolation was profound. I lived alone in a small apartment 30 minutes from the office, my personal life reduced to grocery shopping and gym memberships. Dating was nearly impossible when you couldn't explain your job, your schedule, or why you sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time for assignments you couldn't discuss. The few relationships I attempted ended quickly when men either felt intimidated by my intelligence or frustrated by my inability to share details about my work. Meanwhile, my family's phone calls became exercises in creative omission. When they asked about my work, I offered vague responses about computer consulting and government contracts. When they asked about my personal life, I had little to offer beyond updates on my health and the weather. Victoria's life, by contrast, was an open book they could read and celebrate. Her elegant wedding to Harrison, a corporate lawyer from a prominent family, their beautiful home in Charleston's historic district, her involvement in the Junior League and various charitable organizations, their discussions about starting a family and continuing the sterling legacy. During our monthly family calls, I would listen to updates about Victoria's latest social triumphs while staring at classified documents that detailed cyber threats to the nation's infrastructure. The disconnect was surreal. They worried about Victoria's choice of china patterns, while I worried about keeping the power grid operational. They celebrated her charity luncheons while I tracked digital infiltration attempts by hostile foreign governments. The promotions came quickly, along with increasing responsibility and deeper clearances. Within 4 years, I was leading a team of analysts working on defensive protocols for systems so sensitive that our office existed off the official organizational chart. My colleagues were brilliant minds from MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon, people who spoke in acronyms and thought in algorithms. But success in this world came with a price measured in relationships never formed, conversations never shared, experiences never explained. I was building a career protecting millions of people who would never know my name, working on projects that would never appear on any resume, solving problems that would never be discussed outside of secure conference rooms. Each holiday visit home became more difficult. I would sit at the family dinner table, surrounded by relatives discussing their conventional lives, while carrying knowledge about threats that could affect them all. I knew which foreign governments were testing vulnerabilities in the regional power grid. I knew which criminal organizations were targeting the bank, where Victoria's husband worked. I knew how fragile the digital infrastructure really was that supported their comfortable suburban existence. But I couldn't tell them any of it. Not because I didn't trust them, but because the clearances I held and the work I did existed in a compartmentalized world where information was shared only on a need-to-know basis. So I became the family enigma, the daughter with the mysterious government job, who couldn't explain what she did or why it mattered. They interpreted my silence as aloofness, my inability to share details as lack of achievement. In their world, success was measurable and visible. In mine, the greatest successes were the disasters that never happened, the attacks that were stopped before anyone knew they had been attempted. The irony was crushing. While they worried about my inability to find a husband, I was defending the infrastructure that protected millions of families. While they fretted about my lack of social skills, I was briefing senior military officials on threats that could destabilize entire regions. 16 minutes now. I checked my watch again, and felt the familiar weight of the secure phone in my pocket. The call that was coming would bridge these two worlds in a way I had never imagined possible. For the first time in 12 years, my family was about to understand exactly what their failure of a daughter had been doing with her life. The call came on a Friday evening in April, just as I was finishing a classified briefing about emerging threats to the nation's healthcare systems. I was walking to my car in the secure parking garage, when my personal phone buzzed with a number I recognized immediately. Alexandra, this is Harrison, Victoria's husband. His voice was strained, urgent. I'm calling from the hospital. Your father, he's had a stroke. The drive from Virginia to Charlotte became a blur of interstate highways and rising panic. I had been so immersed in protecting the country's digital infrastructure that I had forgotten how fragile the infrastructure of my own life really was. During the 4-hour drive, I tried calling my family repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Emergency surgery, Harrison had said. Critical condition. I arrived at Carolina Medical Center at 11:45 p.m., still wearing the Navy suit I had put on 16 hours earlier for the Pentagon briefing. The neurological intensive care waiting room smelled like antiseptic and fear, filled with the kind of harsh lighting that made everyone look pale and vulnerable. My family was clustered near the windows, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. My mother sat in a vinyl chair, clutching tissues and staring at her hands. Victoria paced near the coffee machine, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes wrinkled from hours of worry. Harrison sat beside my mother, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Alexandra. My mother looked up when she saw me, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. You came. There was surprise in her voice, as if my presence at my father's bedside was unexpected rather than inevitable. As if the daughter who had spent the last decade protecting strangers wouldn't drop everything to be there for her own family. How is he? I asked, settling into the chair across from them. Victoria stopped pacing long enough to deliver the medical update with characteristic precision. Massive stroke. They did emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain around 10 o'clock. The doctor says the next 72 hours are critical. We settled into the familiar rhythm of hospital waiting. Periods of tense conversation followed by long stretches of silence, punctuated by updates from medical staff who spoke in careful, measured tones. I had brought my secure laptop, thinking I might be able to work remotely while we waited, but the reality of watching my father fight for his life made classified threat assessments seem suddenly trivial. It was during one of these quiet moments, around dawn on the second day, that I overheard the conversation that shattered everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. Victoria and Harrison were standing near the vending machines, speaking in whispers they thought were private. I was pretending to read a magazine, but their words carried clearly in the early morning. Stillness. I don't understand why she's even here, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying that familiar edge of irritation. It's not like she's been part of this family for years. Harrison's response was gentler, but equally cutting. Maybe this will help her realize she needs to get her priorities straight. I mean, she's 36 and she doesn't even have a real relationship, let alone a career. That's what I'm talking about, Victoria continued, warming to the topic. Dad's lying in there fighting for his life, and Mom's worried about the medical bills, the insurance coverage, the long-term care costs. And Alexandra shows up acting like she can help when everyone knows she's been unemployed for months. My blood went cold. Unemployed for months. Your mom mentioned that she got fired from that computer company, Harrison added. Something about not being able to work in a team environment. I feel bad for her. But honestly, this family crisis is going to require real solutions from people with actual careers and financial stability. I set down the magazine, my hands trembling slightly. Computer company. They thought I worked for some generic tech company. After 12 years of classified service, after building defensive systems that protected millions of Americans, after rising to a position where I briefed senators and Pentagon officials on national security threats, my own family thought I was unemployed. The realization hit me like a physical blow. All those years of vague answers about government consulting and computer work had crystallized in their minds as unemployment, failure, an inability to hold down a basic job. They had constructed an entire narrative about my life based on their own limited understanding, filling in the gaps with assumptions that painted me as everything I wasn't. I thought about the security clearances, the classified projects, the 20-hour days spent protecting infrastructure they depended on every day. I thought about the threats I couldn't tell them about, the victories I couldn't share, the recognition I couldn't accept publicly. In trying to protect them from the reality of my work, I had allowed them to create a fiction that was worse than any truth. But the betrayal went deeper than misunderstanding. Over the next 3 days, as we took shifts at my father's bedside, I began to notice the pattern of exclusion that had been carefully constructed around me. Important family decisions were discussed when I stepped out for coffee. Medical updates were shared with Victoria first, then filtered to me through secondhand conversations. Financial discussions about my father's care happened in hushed conferences that stopped when I approached. On the 4th day, when my father was finally stable enough for limited visitors, I discovered the extent of my isolation. My mother was updating a list of people to call with the good news, and I offered to help make some of the calls. "Oh, that's sweet of you, honey," she said, "but Victoria already took care of the important ones. The pastor, your father's business partners, his golf buddies, people who actually understand what's happening and can offer real support. People who actually understand what's happening." The implication was clear. I wasn't one of those people, despite being his daughter, despite dropping everything to be there, despite sitting in that waiting room for 4 days straight. I was still the outsider looking in. The final blow came when we were discussing my father's recovery plan. The doctor had explained that he would need months of rehabilitation, ongoing medical care, and significant lifestyle modifications. The family was gathering around Victoria's kitchen table to discuss logistics, finances, and care coordination. "The good news is that Dad's insurance is comprehensive," Victoria was saying, spreading paperwork across the table like battle plans. "And between Harrison's law practice and my trust fund, we can help cover any gaps that insurance doesn't handle. Mom, you can count on us for whatever you need." I waited for my name to be mentioned, for someone to acknowledge that I might be able to contribute to my father's care. The silence stretched on. Finally, I spoke up. "I'd like to help with the medical expenses, whatever insurance doesn't cover." The look that passed between Victoria and my mother was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. The look that said they were indulging the family charity case, the unemployed daughter who couldn't possibly contribute anything meaningful to a serious financial discussion. "That's very thoughtful, Alexandra," my mother said in the tone she used with children offering to help with grown-up problems. "But this is going to be expensive. Real money. We can't ask you to take on that kind of burden when you're already struggling to find stable employment." Already struggling to find stable employment. They actually believed I was unemployed, possibly living paycheck to paycheck, certainly incapable of handling adult financial responsibilities. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I was earning a 6-figure salary in a position that required Senate confirmation, and they were worried about my ability to contribute to family expenses. But the worst part wasn't their misunderstanding of my career. It was the realization that they had excluded me from family decisions for years, not out of cruelty but out of pity. They genuinely believed they were protecting me from responsibilities I couldn't handle, conversations I wouldn't understand, expectations I couldn't meet. "Alexandra, sweetheart," my mother continued gently, "we know you're trying your best, but this situation requires people who understand finance, insurance, legal matters. Victoria has experience with these things through Harrison's practice. You focus on getting your own life together first." Getting my own life together. As if the life I had built protecting the digital infrastructure that kept their comfortable world functioning was somehow inadequate because it didn't fit their definition of success for a woman. I sat in that kitchen, surrounded by people who shared my DNA but not my reality, and felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. All those classified briefings, where I couldn't tell them about my work, had been interpreted as having no work to tell them about. All those times I couldn't explain my schedule had been seen as evidence that I had no schedule worth explaining. They weren't malicious. They were protective. They had collectively decided that their fragile, unsuccessful daughter needed to be shielded from the harsh realities of adult life. And in their well-meaning attempts to spare my feelings, they had excluded me from my own family. The cruelest irony was that while they worried about my ability to find a husband and start a family, I was defending the infrastructure that protected millions of families. While they fretted about my lack of traditional feminine accomplishments, I was one of the few women in the country with the expertise to prevent cyber attacks that could cripple entire regions. I excused myself from the discussion and walked out to my car, sitting in Victoria's circular driveway as the North Carolina humidity pressed against the windows. 12 minutes now. In 12 minutes, everything would change. But in that moment, all I could feel was the crushing weight of being invisible to the people who should have seen me most clearly. I had spent my career protecting people who didn't know my name from threats they couldn't imagine. But I had never imagined that the people closest to me would need protection from their own misconceptions about who I was and what I was capable of. The phone in my pocket seemed to pulse with anticipation. 12 minutes until they learned that their unemployed daughter had been hand-selected for the most important assignment of her career. 12 minutes until their carefully constructed narrative about my failure would shatter completely. But even as I waited for vindication, I couldn't shake the sadness of realizing that for 12 years, I had been a stranger in my own family's story. The decision crystallized in my mind as I sat in Victoria's driveway, the weight of 12 years of misunderstanding pressing down on my chest like a physical force. I wasn't going to let this continue. Not the pity, not the exclusion, not the carefully constructed fiction they had built around my life. But I also wasn't going to handle it the way the old Alexandra might have, with hurt feelings and ineffective explanations that would only confirm their belief that I couldn't handle adult conversation. I was going to approach this the same way I approached every complex problem in my professional life. Strategically, methodically, with overwhelming evidence and unshakable composure. I pulled out my secure phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Director Sarah Mitchell, my immediate supervisor at the Pentagon's Cybersecurity Command. If anyone could help me navigate what was about to happen, it was her. Mitchell, her voice was crisp and professional. Even though it was nearly 1 a.m. on a Sunday. Director, this is Alexander Sterling. I apologize for calling so late, but I have a situation that might affect my availability for Tuesday's intelligence briefing. There was a pause. Director Mitchell was known for her ability to read between the lines, a skill that had served her well during her 25-year career in military intelligence. Personal matter? Family medical emergency. My father had a stroke. He's stable now, but I hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Director, my family doesn't know what I do for a living. Security protocols aside, they think I'm unemployed. It's created some complications. Another pause. Longer this time. How can I help, Sterling? I may need to brief them on my actual position. Obviously within the parameters of what's declassified, but they need to understand that I'm not what they think I am. Understood. Are you requesting a formal disclosure briefing? I hadn't even considered that possibility. Is that an option? For family members who need to understand the general nature of classified work, absolutely, standard protocol for personnel in sensitive positions. I can have our public affairs office prepare a family briefing packet, nothing classified, but enough to establish the legitimacy and importance of your position. Relief flooded through me. That would be incredibly helpful. I'll have something prepared by Monday morning. Sterling? Her voice softened slightly. For what it's worth, I've reviewed your work. What you've built. What you've protected. Your family should be proud. After hanging up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The confidence that comes from having institutional support. I wasn't going to face this alone with nothing but my word against their preconceptions. I would have documentation, official recognition, the weight of the United States government behind my professional identity. But the phone call to Director Mitchell was just the beginning. Over the next few hours, I began constructing what I could only describe as a comprehensive response strategy. Not revenge. I had no interest in humiliating my family. But clarity, crystal clear, undeniable clarity about who I was and what I had accomplished. I started with my credentials. My personnel file, suitably redacted for family disclosure, painted a picture of steady advancement through increasingly responsible positions, MIT graduate degree, with highest honors. Security clearances that required congressional notification, performance evaluations that used words like exceptional, critical, and irreplaceable. Commendations from senior military leaders whose names would be recognizable even to civilians. Next, I compiled a list of colleagues who could speak to my professional reputation. Not classified details, but general statements about my competence, my leadership, my contributions to national security. Dr. Chen, now a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Professor Williams, who had gone on to direct the NSA's academic liaison program, General Rodriguez, who had worked with me on infrastructure protection initiatives. The most powerful evidence, however, would be the phone call itself. The one I knew was coming in approximately 9 minutes. Because 4 days ago, while my family was discussing my unemployed status in hospital whispers, I had received an encrypted message that would change everything. The message had come through official channels, bearing the digital signature of the Pentagon's highest levels of command. A new threat had emerged, something beyond the scope of normal cybersecurity protocols. Foreign intelligence services had developed attack vectors that could simultaneously target multiple critical infrastructure systems, power grids, financial networks, transportation hubs, and communication systems. The kind of coordinated attack that could cripple the country within hours. Existing defensive protocols were inadequate. The threat required someone who understood not just individual systems, but the interconnected vulnerabilities that linked them together. Someone who could design comprehensive defensive strategies that protected the entire network rather than just individual components. The message had been brief. Report to Pentagon Monday 0700 for assignment to Operation Digital Shield. Bring everything. This is the big one, Operation Digital Shield. Even I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew enough about Pentagon operational structure to understand that named operations weren't assigned to mid-level analysts. They were assigned to people who had been hand-selected for the most sensitive, most critical work the government had to offer. I had spent the last 4 days in the hospital thinking about that message, wondering if I should cut my family visit short to prepare for whatever Monday would bring. But now I realized that fate had provided perfect timing. In approximately 8 minutes, my phone would ring with a call that would transform my family's understanding of my life in the most dramatic way possible. The decision crystallized in my mind as I sat in Victoria's driveway, the weight of 12 years of misunderstanding pressing down on my chest like a physical force. I wasn't going to let this continue. Not the pity, not the exclusion, not the carefully constructed fiction they had built around my life. But I also wasn't going to handle it the way the old Alexandra might have, with hurt feelings and ineffective explanations that would only confirm their belief that I couldn't handle adult conversations. I was going to approach this the same way I approached every complex problem in my professional life, strategically, methodically, with overwhelming evidence and unshakable composure. I pulled out my secure phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Director Sarah Mitchell, my immediate supervisor at the Pentagon's Cybersecurity Command. If anyone could help me navigate what was about to happen, it was her. Mitchell? Her voice was crisp and professional, even though it was nearly 1 a.m. on a Sunday. Director, this is Alexandra Sterling. I apologize for calling so late, but I have a situation that might affect my availability for Tuesday's intelligence briefing. There was a pause. Director Mitchell was known for her ability to read between the lines, a skill that had served her well during her 25-year career in military intelligence. Personal matter? Family medical emergency. My father had a stroke. He's stable now. But I hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Director, my family doesn't know what I do for a living. Security protocols aside, they think I'm unemployed. It's created some complications. Another pause, longer this time. How can I help, Sterling? I may need to brief them on my actual position. Obviously within the parameters of what's declassified, but they need to understand that I'm not what they think I am. Understood. Are you requesting a formal disclosure briefing? I hadn't even considered that possibility. Is that an option? For family members who need to understand the general nature of classified work. Absolutely. Standard protocol for personnel in sensitive positions. I can have our public affairs office prepare a family briefing packet. Nothing classified, but enough to establish the legitimacy and importance of your position. Relief flooded through me. That would be incredibly helpful. I'll have something prepared by Monday morning. Sterling. Her voice softened slightly. For what it's worth, I've reviewed your work. What you've built. What you've protected. Your family should be proud. After hanging up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The confidence that comes from having institutional support. I wasn't going to face this alone with nothing but my word against their preconception.
I would have documentation.
Official recognition. The weight of the United States government behind my professional identity. But the phone call to Director Mitchell was just the beginning. Over the next few hours, I began constructing what I could only describe as a comprehensive response strategy. Not revenge. I had no interest in humiliating my family, but clarity. Crystal clear, undeniable clarity about who I was and what I had accomplished. I started with my credentials. My personnel file, suitably redacted for family disclosure, painted a picture of steady advancement through increasingly responsible positions. MIT graduate degree with highest honors. Security clearances that required congressional notification. Performance evaluations that used words like exceptional, critical, and irreplaceable. Commendations from senior military leaders whose names would be recognizable even to civilians. Next, I compiled a list of colleagues who could speak to my professional reputation. Not classified details, but general statements about my competence, my leadership, my contributions to national security. Dr. Chen, now a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Professor Williams, who had gone on to direct the NSA's academic liaison program, General Rodriguez, who had worked with me on infrastructure protection initiatives. The most powerful evidence, however, would be the phone call itself, the one I knew was coming in. Approximately 9 minutes, because 4 days ago, while my family was discussing my unemployed status in hospital whispers, I had received an encrypted message that would change everything. The message had come through official channels, bearing the digital signature of the Pentagon's highest levels of command. A new threat had emerged, something beyond the scope of normal cybersecurity protocols. Foreign intelligence services had developed attack vectors that could simultaneously target multiple critical infrastructure systems, power grids, financial networks, transportation hubs, and communication systems. The kind of coordinated attack that could cripple the country within hours. Existing defensive protocols were inadequate. The threat required someone who understood not just individual systems, but the interconnected vulnerabilities that linked them together. Someone who could design comprehensive defensive strategies that protected the entire network, rather than just individual components. The message had been brief. Report to Pentagon Monday, 0700 for assignment to Operation Digital Shield. Bring everything. This is the big one. Operation Digital Shield. Even I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew enough about Pentagon operational structure to understand that named operations weren't assigned to mid-level analysts. They were assigned to people who had been hand-selected for the most sensitive, most critical work the government had to offer. I had spent the last 4 days in the hospital thinking about that message, wondering if I should cut my family visit short to prepare for whatever Monday would bring. But now I realized that fate had provided perfect timing. In approximately 8 minutes, my phone would ring with a call that would transform my family's understanding of my life in the most dramatic way possible. I walked back into Victoria's living room just as my mother was organizing sympathy cards from my father's colleagues. The scene was painfully domestic. Victoria arranging flowers that had been delivered throughout the day. Harrison reviewing insurance paperwork at the dining table. My mother carefully sorting through casseroles from neighbors. The picture of a family handling a crisis together, except for the daughter they believed couldn't contribute anything meaningful. Alexandra, sweetheart. My mother said without looking up from the cards. Victoria was just saying that you should probably head back home soon. I know you don't have much vacation time at wherever it is you're working now. Wherever it is you're working now. The casual dismissal in those words crystallized everything I had been feeling for the past 4 days. I checked my watch. 42 seconds. Actually, Mom, I'd like to talk to all of you about something important. Victoria glanced up from her flower arranging with mild irritation. Alexandra, if this is about contributing to Dad's medical bills, we already discussed this. We appreciate the gesture, but the phone rang. Not my personal phone. The secure line. The sound was different, sharper, more urgent, a sound that had preceded some of the most critical moments of my career. I looked down at the caller ID. Pentagon, Command, Priority 1. I need to take this, I said, my voice suddenly carrying an authority that made everyone in the room look up. I answered on the second ring. Sterling here. Miss Sterling, this is General Patricia Hayes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I apologize for calling on the weekend, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. The room went completely silent. My family's conversation stopped mid-sentence. Flower arrangements frozen halfway to the vase. Insurance papers held motionless in the air. The voice on the phone was crisp, commanding, and loud enough that everyone could hear it clearly. Yes, General, I replied, my tone shifting into the professional register I used for high-level briefings. What's the nature of the situation? We've detected coordinated probing of critical infrastructure systems. Power grids in Florida and California, financial networks in New York, transportation hubs in Chicago. The attack patterns match the theoretical scenarios you outlined in your classified assessment 4 months ago. We need you in the Pentagon Situation Room by 0600 Monday morning to lead Operation Digital Shield. My mother's hand went to her throat. Victoria's mouth fell slightly open. Harrison's eyes widened as he processed what he was hearing. Understood, General. I'll be there. Alexandra, I want to be clear about something. The General's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. This assignment carries executive-level clearance. You'll be briefing the President's National Security Team directly. The Secretary of Defense specifically requested you for this operation based on your track record with infrastructure protection. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my family breathing, could sense their shock radiating outward like ripples in still water. I understand the responsibility, General. You can count on me. I know we can. That's why you're our first call. One more thing, Sterling. This operation is classified at the highest levels, but given the critical nature of the threat, we're authorizing you to brief your immediate family on the general scope of your work. A courier is en route to your current location with a family disclosure packet. Victoria's flower stems slipped from her fingers and scattered across the floor. Thank you, General. I'll see you Monday morning. Outstanding. Sterling? The country is counting on you. Don't let us down. Never have, General. Never will. I ended the call and looked up at 3 faces that had transformed completely in the span of 2 minutes. The condescending pity was gone, replaced by something between shock and awe. My mother spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexandra, who was that? General Patricia Hayes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She's my ultimate commanding officer. Harrison stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. Commanding officer, Alexandra, what do you do? Before I could answer, there was a knock at the front door. Sharp, professional, precisely 3 times. I knew that knock. Government courier. That'll be the briefing packet, I said, walking to the door with the same confidence I brought to Pentagon meetings. The courier was exactly what I expected. Early 30s, conservative suit, government-issued briefcase, posture that screamed former military. Ms. Alexandra Sterling? That's me. Family disclosure packet from the Department of Defense. I'll need to see your ID and get your signature. I signed for the packet while my family watched from the living room, their expressions shifting between confusion and growing comprehension. The courier left as efficiently as she had arrived, and I returned to face 3 people who were seeing me clearly for the first time in 12 years. I opened the packet and spread its contents across Victoria's coffee table. Official letterhead from the Pentagon. My personnel file, Heavily redacted, but unmistakably legitimate. Letters of commendation from military leaders whose names made the evening news, a simplified organizational chart showing my position in the Department of Defense hierarchy. A general description of my work protecting critical infrastructure from cyber threats. "This is what I do," I said quietly. "I'm the Chief Technology Officer for the Pentagon's Advanced Research Division. I design and implement defensive systems that protect the nation's critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, power grids, financial networks, transportation systems, communication hubs. The systems that keep this country running." My mother picked up one of the commendation letters with trembling hands. "It says here you've received the Department of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service. 4 times. Yes." Victoria was staring at the organizational chart. "This shows you reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. On certain projects, yes." Harrison's voice was small, uncertain. "Alexandra, we thought," Victoria said, "you were unemployed. That you got fired from some tech company." I sat down across from them. The same calm demeanor I used when briefing senators on national security threats. "I've never worked for a tech company. I've held the highest security clearances this country offers for the past 10 years. The reason I couldn't tell you about my work wasn't because I was ashamed of it. It was because it was classified." The weight of 12 years of misunderstanding hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice hoarse with the strain of processing information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her sister. "Alexandra, why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her, this woman who had been the golden child, the success story, the daughter who fit perfectly into their world of conventional achievements. For the first time, she was looking at me without condescension, without pity, without the protective concern that had defined our relationship for decades. "Because I couldn't," I said simply. "Security clearances come with legal obligations. I couldn't discuss my work, my assignments, my achievements, or my responsibilities. When you asked what I did for a living, I gave you the most general answers I was allowed to give." My mother set down the commendation letter, her hands still shaking slightly. "But, Alexandra, we were so worried about you. We thought you couldn't hold down a job, couldn't support yourself." "I know what you thought." There was no anger in my voice, just the patient tone I used when explaining complex concepts to people who weren't familiar with cybersecurity. "And I understand why you thought so. When someone can't talk about their work, it's natural to assume they don't have work worth talking about." Harrison was studying the personnel file, his finger tracing the timeline of my promotions and clearance upgrades. "This says you've been protecting infrastructure that serves over 300 million Americans every day for the past 12 years. The front door opened, and my father's voice called out, "Victoria? Harrison?" I thought I heard voices. He appeared in the living room doorway, moving slowly with his walker, his color better than it had been in days. "What's all this?" My mother gestured toward the documents spread across the coffee table. "William, sit down. Alexandra has something to tell us." My father settled into his favorite chair, the one Victoria had brought from his house after the stroke. I began again, explaining my career, my responsibilities, my reason for secrecy. As I spoke, I watched his expression change from confusion to surprise to something that looked like pride. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Daughter, I owe you an apology." "Dad, you don't." "Yes, I do." His voice carried the authority that had built a successful construction company from nothing. "We all do. We made assumptions about your life without ever asking the right questions. We excluded you from family decisions because we thought you couldn't handle responsibility, when the truth is you've been handling more responsibility than any of us could imagine." Victoria cleared her throat. Her face flushed with embarrassment. "Alexandra, yesterday I told Harrison you weren't career material. Today I find out you're leading teams that protect the entire country." "Victoria." "No, let me finish." She stood up, began pacing the way she did when she was processing difficult information. "Do you know what I do?" I organize charity luncheons. I plan fundraising galas. Important work. Sure, but you're briefing the president's staff on national security. The president, Alexandra. I realized at that moment that this conversation wasn't just about correcting their misunderstanding of my career. It was about fundamentally reshaping our family dynamic. For my entire adult life, I had been the child who needed protection, guidance, patience. Now they were discovering that I was the one whose work protected them. My mother spoke softly. All those times you couldn't visit for holidays, all those short phone calls. I was deployed, or working on classified projects with impossible deadlines, or traveling to secure facilities I couldn't tell you about, and we thought you were avoiding us because you were embarrassed about your situation. I was never embarrassed about my situation, Mom. I was proud of my work. I just couldn't share that pride with the people I most wanted to share it with. Harrison wiped his eyes, his voice thick with emotion. Alexandra, we owe you such an apology. And congratulations. I mean, the Pentagon calling on a Sunday because they need you specifically. That's incredible. My father leaned forward in his chair. Daughter, about the medical expenses we discussed, I want you to know that if you can contribute, we'd be grateful for the help. I misjudged your capabilities. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in days. Dad, I'd be honored to help. And for what it's worth, my health insurance through the government is excellent. I can probably get you added as a dependent for the recovery period. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The daughter they thought needed taking care of was offering to take care of them. Over the next 2 hours, we talked more honestly than we had in 12 years. I told them about MIT, about the security clearances, about the work that had consumed my life. They told me about their worries, their assumptions, their well-meaning attempts to protect me from responsibilities they thought I couldn't handle. As the evening grew late, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. Not just their understanding of my career, but their respect for the choices I had made. The daughter who had always been on the outside was suddenly the one whose expertise they sought, whose opinion they valued, whose presence they genuinely wanted. The secure phone buzzed with another message. Update, threat level elevated. Recommend arriving Pentagon 0500 instead of 0600. General Hayes. I showed the message to my family. My father read it and shook his head in amazement. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is texting you personally. It's the nature of the work, Dad. When national security is at stake, hierarchy becomes fluid. Victoria laughed, a sound of genuine admiration rather than the condescending chuckles I'd grown accustomed to. I complain when the Junior League president emails me after hours. As I prepared to leave for my hotel, my mother hugged me tighter than she had since I was a child. Alexandra, I'm so proud of you. We all are. I'm sorry it took us so long to understand. I'm sorry I couldn't help you understand sooner. My father took my hand in both of his grip stronger than it had been since the stroke. Daughter, you've been protecting all of us this whole time, and we never even knew it. Thank you. Driving back to my hotel, I reflected on the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago I had been the family failure, excluded from important conversations, pitied for my apparent inability to succeed in conventional ways. Tonight, I was the daughter whose career protecting the nation made their local successes seem small by comparison. But more importantly, I was finally seen. After 12 years of being invisible to the people who should have known me best, I was finally truly seen. The next morning, I flew back to Washington for the most important assignment of my career. But for the first time, I carried with me the knowledge that my family understood who I was and what I had chosen to do with my life. The phone call from the Pentagon hadn't just changed their perception of my career. It had given me back my place in my own family. And that, I realized, was worth more than any classified achievement or government commendation I had ever received. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you, right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.